Inflation rate month to month was just just an inch.
Inflation in the United States, it's at an over 40-year high.
Consumer prices increased 8.3% in August.
Inflation at a 40-year high.
I watched an interview the other day, and while Biden conceded that there's a remote possibility that the country may slip into a recession, he said that it's very unlikely that we will go into one, apart from the fact that we're actually in one right now. But he said that if we end up with a recession, it's going to be very short, very shallow, really mild recession. Why would that be? There is no reason to believe that this recession would be short or shallow. In fact, all the evidence is that it will be long and deep. We have got a massive inflation problem on our hands. Normally, when the economy goes into a recession, the Federal Reserve tries to stimulate the economy by creating inflation. But since this recession has been caused by inflation, the Federal Reserve has been sidelined. Not only can't the Fed stimulate the economy, it's going to be forced to sedate the economy.
And I ultimately think we're going to see a real shock in terms of how high consumer prices are going to rise.
Started talking about between the United Kingdom and the United States, where you have traders selling pounds because tax cuts are going to increase debt in Britain and buying dollars, despite the fact that the US has a much bigger debt problem than the UK. The other reason that the markets were punishing the pound was because the British government was working at cross purposes with the Bank of England, in that the Bank of England was trying to fight inflation by raising rates and having a tighter monetary policy, while the government was taking the opposite approach with fiscal policy and was pursuing an expansionary fiscal policy with tax cuts. Well, the United States did the exact same thing, except our expansionary policy was not by cutting taxes, but by increasing government spending. What were the most recent pieces of legislation passed by the U.S. Congress? Well, the inappropriately named Inflation Reduction Act, which was a spending bill which increased spending on infrastructure and other things. Then you had the CHIPS Act, which increased government spending and doled out money to chip companies. And you had the forgiveness of student loans, which doled out money to anybody that owed money on student loans.
Now it's time to address the burden of student debt in the same way. Here's what my administration is going to do: provide more breathing room for people so they have less burden by student debt.
One piece of news that did come out during the week that should be helping investors to figure out this problem is the announcement from the Social Security Administration that it is going to be raising the payments next year, these are the COLAs, by 8.7%. That is the biggest increase in 40 years. That's going to cost the government over $100 billion. So that adds over $100 billion each year to the budget deficits, which adds to the national debt. How could this not be inflationary? And of course, not only are these larger deficits inflationary, which ultimately will be financed by the Fed, but what do the people who receive the $100 billion do with the money when they get it? They go out and spend it. So in other words, prices are going up, and the government responds by printing more money and sending it to people so they have more money to pay those higher prices, which means the prices go even higher. People are supposed to cut back when prices go up. But if the government gives everybody more money to pay the higher prices, then you're just fueling the inflation, and it's like a dog chasing its tail. You're never going to catch it, which is why the government's never going to bring inflation down. Remember, in order for the government to collect Social Security revenue, people have to be in the labor force and working. The government needs young people working and paying into the system so we can keep this PONZI scheme going. The problem is those young people aren't there working. And in fact, older people are retiring earlier. And so we have this smaller labor force participation rate. And so the gap between what the government collects in Social Security taxes and what it's spending in benefits is rising, especially now with this new increase, this 8.7% increase, because wages aren't going up anywhere near 8.7%. That means the collections of Social Security taxes are not rising nearly as much as what the government is paying out in benefits. So all of this is adding to the inflationary spiral. We've got low interest rates, and so even though we have a huge debt, the cost to pay the interest on that debt is really low. Well, what Janet Yellen was overlooking back then was the fact that these low interest rates weren't here to stay, that low interest rates could become high interest rates. And so since you have no control over those interest rates, if interest rates go up, then you're screwed.
Colleagues and I are recognizing the considerable progress the economy has made toward our dual objectives of maximum employment and price stability.
In fact, the most ironic thing is, I remember when S&P downgraded U.S. Treasuries. It was the first time that had happened. They downgraded U.S. Treasuries, and people were so worried about the downgrade of U.S. Treasuries that there was a flight to quality into U.S. Treasuries. So people bought U.S. Treasuries as a safe haven from U.S. Treasuries. That shows you how ridiculous it is. Well, it's ridiculous for anybody worried about a country having too much debt to sell that country's currency and then buy the US dollar, which has even more debt. Instead, it's bad news because investors still don't understand what it portends. But eventually they will. But before they figure it out, they are giving gold away, and all it is a buying opportunity for the people who understand. So the people who are listening to me that know how this is going to play out, you're able to buy more gold at a price that's much lower than what you should be buying if more people understood the reality of inflation. And in fact, silver had an even bigger down week. Silver had been outperforming, and it really got clobbered this week. It was down about 9%. It closed the week at $18.23. But again, neither gold or silver made new lows on this move, something that the stock market did. So on a relative basis, the metals are holding up better than the stock market. We restructure the debt and we tell our creditors you're not going to get your money. But I don't think politicians have the integrity to do that. They're going to take the coward's way out. They're going to print. They're going to inflate the debt away. That's the only way out of this problem, is to monetize that debt and repudiate it through inflation, which is why it's crazy for anybody to believe that the Fed is going to succeed in reducing inflation back down to 2%. It can't succeed. Even when the Fed hikes rates to 4% in November, you're still half the inflation rate. You're still discouraging people from saving and encouraging people to take on more debt. You are stoking inflation's fires. You're not putting it out. But even worse than the headline number was the core, because there the expectation was for a monthly rise of 0.4, which would have been a 33% reduction from the 0.6% rise in the core from the previous month. But instead, we had a 0.6% increase. That was higher than the high range of estimates, which went from 0.3 to 0.5. In fact, it doesn't make any sense that the markets continue to expect better numbers on inflation, yet continue to be surprised when those numbers come out worse than expected. Again, the classic definition of insanity, doing the same thing over and over again, yet expecting a different result. In fact, the insanity goes all the way back to the days when everybody just said inflation was transitory.